what's so striking with your images is, okay, we can talk about the storytelling aspect of them and your projects and the greater voice of your work, but the aesthetics and the way you put images together. How did you learn? How did you kind of cultivate that? How did you evolve that over your formative years?
Thank you very much. Well, I think I started off rather heavy handed with lighting and then I dialed it back. But learning in reverse, what I mean is most photographers, they start with natural light and then add something to it over time when they figure out studio lights. Me, I think I was using strobes before I fully understood natural light. Just to put it here, blast it, right? Perfect. Um, but so I think when I learned in backwards is just how to kind of work. What's good about the studio light is it's just a little bit of elevation from the scene, right? So like a little, adding a little
Mm.
bit of control, a little bit of a painterly quality, a little bit of something otherworldly, or let's say dignifying the person, right? That's a good quality about Flash. A bad quality is it can make everything look artificial, which is the opposite of what I'm trying to do. So using a little bit of that with knowledge of natural light, I think really helped me a lot grow over the years. So how I put things together now is maybe study what's already naturally happening within the scene and then seeing how my vision as a photographer can slightly elevate things or slightly translate things better to a 2D medium. Because in the world, we walk around it, we experience it. Our interactions with things are not two-dimensional, but we have a two-dimensional craft. So lighting can help elevate that and kind of bring a sense of cohesion across various things that look different. So I think when I started to interpret things in that way and see a photo kind of more like a painting, where certain things are brought to the forefront, certain things are in focus, certain things are just kind of composed for the human eye versus reality. This sort of started my style as a photographer, um, and then I think over the time it's just gotten more refined and more refined. And then I also believe that the edit of work, I'm not talking about post production or retouching, but the edit meaning how stories are told through photo selections is very
Mm.
important. The flow of the book, the flow of the story, cutting between wide and close up, a kind of a backbone for a project. In the Ethiopia book, it's portraits that were inside of the nomadic studio tent. That's the backbone of it. And then what do you throw on top of it? There can be a kind of a formula for uh, different visuals to fit together into a pattern, if that makes sense. Because what you don't want to do is fall in love with every photo that you've ever taken and have to show it. I think what's more important is to be very brutal and be able to like remove things from a story to make it stronger and show a variety of things that maybe as individual pieces they become weaker, but the sum of all the parts makes a photo collection. That's why I think like I also see in large collections or I see in books versus kind of like individual heavy hitting photos. There might be a few of those if I'm lucky in a collection, but mostly I really prefer when my work is experienced as a book, like turning the pages, feeling the flow of it, feeling what I put in, what I left out. To me, there's a lot more variables to play with as a photographer when you do that because you don't have to say everything you want to say inside of a single picture. Instead, you're saying it with the edit itself.
What does that process look like for you? Do you have all your images and then you take some kind of space away from that for a while and then come back to it and start curating, selecting? And do you edit them all first? How does it all work? And Jerry's mind?
I think so if I could use the example of the Ethiopia book again,
Hmm.
is I when I started to think that this could be a book, I already had an archive of images that I had to go through and make selections for. But I couldn't do that until the other stuff was shot. So it was an active process of shooting a little bit, going through, making selects, taking out this, putting in this. Um, for me, it's the most simple ingredient would be kind of coverage, right? So it's like what's like a very wide shot, what's a very close up shot, mix those together. I think that's like the easiest way to see this.
Okay.
But then add more and more on top of that. What's the diversity of the country that I'm photographing? Okay, so like which ethnic groups are represented, which are not. How does it mix in terms of visual language when it flows? Is it very jarring, like as a spread, to see two things that are shot within the same color palette or even from the same perspective of like both of these are like wide shots? It'd be nicer if like one was close up, one was
Hmm.
far away. What am I even trying to say as a photographer? So for example, I describe the Ethiopia book as a love letter. Well, it's a dignified look at Ethiopia. It's like whatever it's the way that I see the country. So because of that, there's a lot of poverty and things that exist in Ethiopia but are left out of the edit, right? I have a lot of photography where I even was working with NGOs inside Ethiopia that could go in this book, but then it ruins the greater arc of the narrative of the book itself. Yes, these photos were shot in Ethiopia. Yes, they're in regions where I wish I could include more of that in the book, but that's not what I'm trying to say with this particular project. So it's like, what is the goal of all of this? And does including that photo selection in here reach that goal or not? Simple question, right? So, because the book is divided into geographic regions, right, like northeast, southwest, center, those are all kind of subsections. And then within those exist all of the other parameters that I just described. And then the sum of all those parts, northeast, southwest, make up the Ethiopia book. Because the other thing is, Ethiopia is a country where there is 80 different languages spoken, right? Uh, so the idea of Ethiopia itself is a modern day nation state that includes all of these things inside of the invisible geographic borders that we know today. But the reason why all these different people are here is way before the nation state borders existed that we know today, through different movements of people through time. So what is the book itself? Well, it's kind of a photographic stylistic way to weave all of these very distinct groups together, where my lighting style or my visual approach as a photographer might be like a nation state to unify these into a collective body of work, but also the individual people themselves. uh, you know, we can highlight the diversity and the like beautifully unique things about them, and that like doesn't change from my style. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So that's how I saw, how do you do a book on a country? Because a country is also very arbitrary, right? Like if you look back at ancient maps of Ethiopia, of course it's the only country that was never successfully colonized by Europeans in Africa. So a lot of the borders are the same, but many things are also different. So when you have a title of a book that's a country name, like what is that? That's like a really hard question to solve with photography. That's what the book is.
But you stamp on that you can stamp your own interpretation on the word of that country, Ethiopia, your interpretation of it, right? Is that is
Yeah, because it's a visual medium.
Mm-hmm.
So the things I'm doing with lighting, the portrait tent, the lighting style could be the grand unifier of all of this. And of course, culturally, there's things that are inherent in the country that are unifying anyway. All that stuff's going on, with the religion, with the language. Okay. But as a photographer, you are also taking a stylistic approach to this. So that's one of the few things that you can get involved with, that you can have a vision on
Mm-hmm.
when your subjects are real people.
Mm-hmm. How do you balance the?
If it was my own made up world, you know, you could do more things with it. But because it's the world as it is, that's what you add to it as a photographer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you balance the aesthetic style or your intent with the aesthetics with the representing the dignity of the people and the storytelling behind that all, or you know, because I'm just kind of trying to zoom in on a photo shoot with you in the tent.
Yeah.
Is what is priority number one there, and how do you balance these kind of two things that you bring together, of course, but they kind of are separate to begin with in terms of style, lighting, visuals, people, goal, story.
Right.
How do you kind of go about balancing those?
A great photograph should have both. You should feel the hand of the photographer. This is what I believe. Other people don't see it that way. They might be more purist, and that's okay. You know, the kind of photography that I admire, you can feel the style of the artist, but equally so you can feel the people there. So for me, it's always that balance, and it's not something that like you just know and do. It's like something you have to constantly work on and work out as you're there, right? Because there's some things that I think would be great, but they're not happening, right? Versus if I were Sam and I could paint everything, there'd be a different artistic expression.
Right.
Photography is an artistic expression where you're actually photographing real things. So there's very few things that you can actually control. But what an artist, like what a photographer does choose to control, results in the outcome of the work. So, for example, one of my favorite photographers is Sebastião Salgado. You can really feel his presence and his hand in the work, right? What's another one of like who's your favorite photographer and why? No, like really, like can you feel them in it, right? Otherwise, they're just random images.
Yeah.
So if you see this as an art, you want to feel the artist, right?
The first photographer I really got into is Steve McCurry.
Okay.
And
you can feel his hand in
without a doubt.
everything. Yeah.
Without a doubt.
There's a way that he would see the world where another artist in his same place wouldn't see it that way.
Yeah.
They would do another kind of art.
What I like
But
about
the people could be the same.
but what I like about him and you and some of my favorite photographers is there is always cohesiveness in the aesthetic and the style, but there's also evolution in how that's developed and how that tells a story, which I think is incredibly difficult to do. But the people that do it, you know, are the people that rise to the top, in my opinion.
What about someone like Gregory Crewdson, right? He has the kind of cinematic Americana, large format photography of quintessential American scenes, but sometimes there's something odd or eerie going on.
They're like paintings.
Their paintings are like full on cinema sets.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look back at some of his early work, the first series like Twilight that he did, you can tell like stylistically he wasn't as refined. I mean, he's like cranking lights, things are kind of wacky, but like all the same stuff that he later on and refined in his later series, like Cathedral of the Pines or whatever, it was always there because it comes from him. Like he has a vision. That's the kind of work that I love. He was that person, whether he was a photographer or not. And he like manifested all of this into his visuals. Like I love that. If you look across the board of his work over time, you can see it. Another good example, David LaChapelle. Doesn't matter what he shot, what he did, like you can feel him in there.
Yeah.
Right? There's so many people that photograph the same celebrity. That person exists, but there's no one that did it like him, right? That stuff is like so brilliant to me. That's what I love.
Yeah.
That like really gets me motivated.
Yeah.
Even though I'll never shoot anything like that. I love it.